They called him a liability, a burned-out veteran who couldn't keep up, couldn't follow orders, couldn't belong on a team anymore. Coach Harrington made it official in front of everyone. Locker room, fluorescent lights, 43 pairs of eyes watching Marcus Webb clean out his gear. No ceremony, no dignity, just a cardboard box and a closing door. But that was before the explosion, before the chaos, before 3 Navy SEALs walked into the wreckage, looked past every other man on that field, and called out one name. A name nobody on that team had ever heard. They called him Iron Six, and everything Coach Harrington thought he knew was about to be buried. Marcus Webb arrived at Fort Carson Regional Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in early September, carrying a duffel bag, a coffee that had gone cold somewhere on the interstate, and a resume that read like a man who had given up. 38 years old, former Special Operations medic, multiple deployments, honorable discharge. And now, according to the intake coordinator who barely looked up from her desk, a part-time auxiliary trainer for the base's semi-professional football team, the Carson Commanders. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't supposed to be. Marcus had specifically chosen unglamorous. After everything he'd seen, after everything he'd done, unglamorous felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. He wanted tape jobs and hydration packs and the smell of cut grass. He wanted problems that could be solved with an ice pack and 20 minutes off the field. He did not want to be known. He did not want to be found. The Commanders' head coach, Derek Harrington, was the kind of man who filled every room he entered before his body actually crossed the threshold. 46 years old, former Division I linebacker, 3 regional championships under his belt, and a voice that carried like a stadium PA system even when he was whispering. He looked at Marcus on that first day the way a man looks at a piece of furniture someone else ordered, mildly confused about why it was there and quietly certain it wouldn't last. "Webb," he said, not quite a greeting, extending a hand more as ritual than welcome. "You were Army?" "Yes, sir." "Do anything interesting?" Marcus set his duffel down. "Not particularly." Harrington studied him for a moment with the particular squint of a man who prided himself on reading people and was mildly unsettled when a page wouldn't turn. Then he nodded, slow and final, and said, "All right. Stay out of the way during practice. Handle the medical kits. Don't give me opinions I didn't ask for." Marcus said, "Understood." And he meant it. For 6 weeks, Marcus Webb was furniture. He wrapped ankles with the kind of quiet efficiency that nobody noticed because nobody was supposed to notice. He cataloged injuries with precision that a sports medicine physician at a Division I program would have found impressive had there been anyone paying attention. He spotted 3 early-stage stress fractures in players who would have blown out by mid-season if he hadn't flagged them. He said nothing to Harrington. He submitted the notes through the team physician, Dr. Linda Osei, who began to look at him with the particular narrowed focus of someone trying to solve a question they hadn't thought to ask yet. On a Wednesday afternoon in late October, the Commanders were running full contact drills, and the sky over Colorado had turned the color of a bruise. Marcus was sitting on the bench end, reorganizing the emergency kit, because the kit had been stocked by someone who had never dealt with anything more serious than a sprained wrist, and it showed, when Harrington blew the whistle and called the full roster to midfield. Team meeting, roster decisions. Marcus didn't look up from the kit. He heard his name about 45 seconds in, delivered with the particular flatness of a man announcing a weather delay rather than ending someone's position. "Webb," Harrington's voice, carrying. "Box up your gear. We're bringing in a certified ATC from Colorado Springs. Nothing personal." Marcus looked up slowly. 43 players, some watching him with the blank discomfort of men who didn't know what expression to wear, some checking their phones. 2 freshman linemen who'd been particularly rough on their ankle tape, exchanging a quick look that might, in a different story, have been gratitude. Coach Harrington standing with his clipboard angled like a shield, his assistant coaches flanking him, everything about his posture saying this conversation was already over. Marcus stood up. He picked up the emergency kit. He said, "Yes, sir," and walked to the equipment room. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not tell Derek Harrington what he'd spent 12 years doing in locations that didn't appear on civilian maps. He just started packing. The equipment room was a long, narrow space that smelled of rubber and iron, and Marcus was folding field dressings into the kit with the automatic precision of a man who had done this exact action under conditions that would have been unimaginable to everyone on that field, when the door opened and Dr. Linda Osei leaned in. She was 51, originally from Accra, and had the particular stillness of someone who had practiced medicine long enough to understand that most emergencies were preventable, and that the ones that weren't required a specific kind of calm. She looked at the kit in Marcus's hands. She looked at the way he was folding. She said, "You packed that wrong." Marcus said, "I repacked it the right way 6 weeks ago. It was wrong when I got here." Ozzy stepped fully into the room. She looked at the kit. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you do your trauma training?" Marcus said, "Officially, Fort Sam, Houston. Unofficially, Eastern Africa, Southern Afghanistan, Northern Syria." He zipped the kit. "I don't expect that to change anything," Osei said. "It might." It didn't. Not that day. Marcus finished packing his personal gear, signed out at the front desk, and drove to the motel on Route 24 where he'd been staying because he hadn't yet decided whether to find an apartment, which itself was a clue about how settled he felt in his own continued presence anywhere. He ordered a pizza. He ate about half of it. He watched a documentary about deep-sea fish that he retained nothing of. And at 11:47 in the evening, his phone rang. It was Dr. Osei. Her voice was different. The stillness was still there, but stretched over something that wasn't still at all. "There's been an explosion at the base training facility," she said. "Natural gas, the new multi-purpose building on the East Quadrant. There are people inside." A pause. "A lot of people. The civilian ambulances are 12 minutes out minimum. The base emergency team is responding, but their trauma lead is off-site." Another pause, shorter. "Marcus, how fast can you get back here?" Marcus was already putting on his boots. 7 minutes, he said. He made it in 5. The scene at the East Quadrant was the kind of controlled chaos that reveals exactly who is trained for catastrophe and who has only read about it. 3 sections of the multi-purpose building had partially collapsed. The gas explosion had taken out the northwest wall and brought down a portion of the ceiling over what had been, that evening, a combined session for 2 different training units, plus a group of base family support staff, approximately 60 people in a single structure at the time of detonation. The night air was thick with concrete dust and the particular acrid bite of burnt gas lines. Emergency strobes painted everything in alternating red and white. Marcus moved through the perimeter without stopping. He registered 2 walking wounded sitting against the far fence post, likely blast concussion, non-critical. 1 man being supported by 2 others, right leg at an angle that suggested compound fracture, mobile for now. 3 individuals on the ground inside the immediate collapse zone, motionless. A 4th pressing both hands against his own abdomen with the focused desperation of someone who already knows. He reached the base emergency coordinator, a captain named Reyes, who was shouting into a radio with the specific energy of a man whose training had prepared him for smaller problems. "I'm Marcus Webb," Marcus said. "I'm a trauma medic. Tell me your resource inventory right now." Reyes stared at him. "You're the football trainer. Tell me your resource inventory." Something in the quality of Marcus's voice made Reyes's hand stop moving on the radio. It was not a loud voice. It was not an aggressive voice. It was the voice of someone who had already mentally mapped the next 45 minutes and was simply waiting for the information required to execute them. Reyes gave him the inventory. 2 basic trauma kits, 1 oxygen tank, 1 improvised stretcher, 4 personnel with first aid certification, no surgical capability on site. Marcus said, "All right." He was already moving. "Get me the kits. Get those 4 personnel on the 2 men at the north fence. Walking wounded, keep them seated, monitor for pressure changes, no fluids yet. Your compound fracture needs immobilization before anyone tries to move him. Who's the biggest person you have who's not injured?" Reyes pointed to a specialist named Dawson, 240, not a scratch on him, standing uselessly near the fence with the expression of a man waiting to be useful. "Dawson, come with me." They moved. The man with the abdominal wound was named Sergeant First Class Terry Wills, and he was 44 years old and had been sitting at a folding table completing administrative paperwork when the northwest wall came down, and a section of metal framing had caught him low and right, and he knew it was bad because of the way his body was managing the information differently than pain normally arrives, more remote, more systemic, which is what happens when the damage has gone somewhere that the body keeps its most important machinery. Marcus was beside him in seconds. He pulled Wills's hands away from the wound. He looked, penetrating abdominal trauma. The framing had entered at the right lateral quadrant and exited, which was simultaneously better and worse than the alternative. Better because no retained foreign object. Worse because the exit wound had torn through tissue in a way that was going to complicate pressure management. Marcus could see active bleeding from what his hands told him were likely the intercostal vessels along the lower margin of the wound track. There was peritoneal involvement. There was time, but the clock was already running. He did not say any of this to Wills. He said, "Hey, Terry, my name is Marcus. I've got you. I need you to breathe slow and keep your eyes on me. Can you do that?" Wills looked at him with the particular clarity that severe trauma sometimes produces, a kind of awful lucidity, and said, "Is it bad?" Marcus said, "I've seen worse, and those people were fine." He had his hands in the kit without looking, gauze, wound packing material. He did not have a chest seal, which would have been ideal, but he had what he had. "I'm going to control this bleeding. It's going to feel like pressure. You keep breathing." He packed the wound, precise, measured. The way that you pack a wound when you have done it in moving vehicles in the dark, when you have done it with your hands shaking from your own adrenaline and still made it work. When the stakes have been this high or higher enough times that your hands have developed their own separate memory for what to do when your brain is also running 17 other calculations simultaneously. He had Dawson maintaining compression while he moved to the 3 motionless individuals in the partial collapse zone. The first was unconscious, breathing, head laceration, pupils unequal. Traumatic brain injury, probable. Non-surgical for now, positioning and monitoring. The second was not breathing. Marcus had approximately 90 seconds of history with this man's body and approximately 12 years of context for what to do next. He tilted the airway. He looked, listened, felt. Obstruction, concrete debris partially blocking the pharynx. He cleared it with 2 fingers in the way that someone taught you, because it was medically correct and that you have since had occasion to do in conditions that medical training videos don't acknowledge. The man breathed. Irregular at first, then steadier. Then with the rhythm that means the machine is remembering how to run. Marcus moved. The third person in the collapse zone was a woman in her mid-30s, civilian staff, who had been partially pinned by a section of collapsed ceiling panel. She was conscious and absolutely terrified, and had a right arm that was going to need serious orthopedic attention, but was not in immediate danger of killing her. Marcus established voice contact. He established that she could feel her feet. He established that the panel above her was structurally stable for now, and that moving her required proper extraction, not improvised pulling, which he communicated to Reyes with the clipped efficiency of someone dictating a command rather than requesting permission. Dawson maintains compression on Wills. I need 3 people on controlled panel extraction for the pinned civilian. I need someone on airway monitoring for the unconscious male. Left lateral position. Call me immediately if breathing changes. The compound fracture gets immobilized with whatever rigid material you can source. Doesn't need to be medical, just needs to be rigid and secured. Are we clear? They were clear. Marcus moved through the next 22 minutes the way that water moves through a landscape it has shaped over years, not forceful, not dramatic, inevitable. He was everywhere he needed to be, arriving at each critical moment with exactly the right intervention, his hands remembering procedures that the rest of him had spent 3 years trying to forget. The civilian ambulances arrived 11 minutes into the operation. The paramedics who stepped out had the professional competence of people very good at their jobs, encountering a scene that had already been triaged and organized to a standard they had not expected to find. One of them, a veteran paramedic named Singh, who had 20 years on the job, stopped and looked at what Marcus had built out of 2 trauma kits and 4 barely trained personnel, and then looked at Marcus. "Who set this up?" Singh asked. Reyes pointed. "Him?" Singh looked at Marcus for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you've got." and pulled out his own kit, and they began to work together with the wordless efficiency of professionals who have found each other across different institutions through the shared language of doing things correctly under pressure. Terry Wills was loaded into the first ambulance with vitals that were poor but stable, his bleeding controlled, his airway clear, his body in the position Marcus had placed him. Marcus watched the doors close and felt something in his chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The man who had stopped breathing was conscious by the time they got him out of the collapse zone and was asking confused, frightened questions that were the most beautiful questions Marcus had heard in a long time, because they meant the man was there to ask them. The woman with the pinned arm came out of the rubble with the panel lifted by 4 people working in the coordinated sequence Marcus had prescribed, her arm injured but her spine intact, her eyes wet with tears that she kept apologizing for, even though Marcus told her twice that she had nothing to apologize for. By 12:41 in the morning, all casualties had been evacuated. There were no fatalities. Singh pulled Marcus aside near the edge of the perimeter, where the red and white strobes were finally being cycled down and the night air was starting to clear. He said, "Seriously, what is your background? Because what I just watched you do, that was not standard training." Marcus said, "I was a medic." "Where?" Marcus looked at the ambulances pulling out. He said, "Everywhere that needed one." 3 things happened in the 48 hours after the explosion. The first was that Terry Wills came out of surgery at Fort Carson Regional, the surgeon reporting that the wound packing had been executed with a precision that had almost certainly prevented the patient from exsanguinating before reaching an operating table. The surgeon used the words textbook and exceptional field control, and whoever did this has done this before. These words were documented in a report. The report circulated. The second was that Captain Reyes filed an incident debrief that described, in the careful language of official military documentation, the actions of an individual identified as Marcus Webb, formerly auxiliary trainer for the Carson Commanders football team, currently no institutional affiliation, who had assumed de facto incident command of a mass casualty scene with no formal authority, and had produced outcomes that the base emergency team's own post-incident review rated as optimal given available resources. The third thing happened at 7:15 in the morning on the second day, when Marcus was sitting in the same motel room with the other half of the cold pizza, because he hadn't had the appetite to get anything else, and there was a knock at the door. He opened it. 3 men, military bearing that was visible in the way they stood even in civilian clothes. The one in front was somewhere in his mid-40s, close-cropped silver at the temples, the particular stillness of someone who had long ago resolved the question of whether he was competent enough for whatever was in front of him. He looked at Marcus and said, "Iron 6. Marcus went very still. Nobody had called him that in 3 years. Iron 6 had been his call sign in the 6th Special Operations Support Squadron, assigned after his second deployment when a team commander had described his work in a field hospital improvisation as having the structural integrity of iron, meaning that it held under loads it wasn't designed to hold, meaning that he built systems in chaos that didn't flex or break, meaning that in the worst circumstances he had been tested in, he did not yield. He had not used that name since he left the service. He had not told it to anyone in his civilian life. He had, with some deliberate effort, been trying to become someone to whom it no longer applied. "You're going to need to tell me how you got that name," Marcus said. The man at the door said, "It's in your file. We've had your file for 3 days, since before the explosion." He let that land. "My name is Commander David Luttrell. I'm JSOC's liaison to the new Special Operations Medical Integration Program. We've been looking for a training cadre lead for 6 months. A pause. And then you walked onto our radar when a base medic in Colorado Springs who had never met you submitted an unsolicited commendation to 3 separate oversight committees at 2 in the morning. Marcus said, "Dr. Osei." Lattrell said, "She said, and I'm reading directly here, I have practiced emergency medicine for 27 years. I have never seen anyone manage a mass casualty scene with that level of resource efficiency. Whoever this man is, the military knows exactly who he is, and they are letting him wrap ankles." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's perceptive," Lateral said. "She is. Are you going to invite us in?" Marcus stepped back. What happened in that motel room over the next 2 hours was less a conversation and more a careful excavation. Lateral knew most of it already. He knew about the incident in Kunduz, the 14-hour mass casualty operation that Marcus had run with 3 medics and supplies intended for a force of 12 that had produced outcomes the after-action review had classified, because the casualty-to-survival ratio was considered a potential security asset. He knew about the training program Marcus had built in a forward operating base in northern Mali that had turned local partner forces into competent first responders in 11 weeks. He knew about the thing that had ended Marcus's service career, though he waited for Marcus to bring it up rather than naming it himself. Marcus brought it up because there was no reason to pretend it wasn't in the room. "Hadia Province," Marcus said. "November, 3 years ago." Lateral nodded. Marcus looked at the wall. He had described this a specific number of times in a specific number of clinical settings, and each time the words felt the same way they felt the first time, like touching something that was still burning. "My team was providing medical support for an extraction operation. The intelligence was wrong. The timing was wrong. We ended up with 6 wounded inside a structure that was supposed to be clear." He stopped, started again. "I got 4 of them out. The other two were gone before I reached them. The AAR said my decision-making was sound. My CO said my decision-making was sound. A board of review said my decision-making was sound." He paused. "I disagreed with all of them," Lateral said. "So you left?" "I couldn't stay," Marcus said. "I kept seeing every patient I treated as a version of one of the 2 I couldn't save. I was technically functional and operationally unreliable. Those are incompatible conditions." "And now?" Marcus was quiet. "Your hands," Lateral said, "are apparently not affected by whatever your assessment of your own reliability is. What you did 2 nights ago, we had 3 operators watching from the base security response who recognized your techniques, recognized them specifically. Because those techniques were developed in a program you helped design." He leaned forward. "They called me before the ambulances left the scene. They said, 'Commander, Iron 6 is in Fort Carson. He's doing it again.'" Marcus looked at him. "They watched you run triage on a mass casualty scene in the dark with civilian resources," Lateral said, "and they said it looked exactly like the training they'd done in your program. Because it was exactly like the training they'd done in your program." A pause. "The program you built still exists. It's running in 4 different commands. It has trained over 400 operators. And its attrition rate on critical trauma scenarios is 40% lower than the standard program it replaced." He let that sit. "You built something that outlasted your own presence in it, and then you came here to wrap ankles." Marcus said, "I was trying to figure out if I was still the person I used to be." Lateral said, "Marcus, the people you couldn't save 3 years ago, they are not proof that you failed. They are proof that you were operating in conditions that were designed to produce failure, and you still got 4 people out who would not have survived without you." He paused. "You are Iron 6. You've always been Iron 6. The question isn't whether you're still that person. The question is what you want to do with it." Marcus did not say yes that morning. He needed 48 hours. He used them to drive into the mountains west of Colorado Springs, where the altitude and the silence and the smell of pine and cold air had a quality that he had found useful for thinking in the period after his discharge, when thinking had been something he'd had to learn to do again from scratch. He thought about Sergeant First Class Terry Wills, and the way his blood had felt on Marcus's hands in the dark, and the way his vitals had read on the ambulance monitor by the time he left the scene. He thought about the man who had stopped breathing and then started again. He thought about the woman in the rubble who had apologized for crying. He thought about 43 players watching him pick up a cardboard box under fluorescent lights. He thought about the 2 men in Hadia Province whose names he still said every morning, not as a punishment, but because forgetting felt like a second loss, and he had decided a long time ago that he would carry them rather than abandon them. He thought about the 400 operators in 4 commands who were running trauma protocols that he had developed, who had internalized procedures he had built, who might be alive at some future moment in some dangerous place because of decisions he had made years ago in a classroom on a forward operating base. He came back down out of the mountains on the second evening. He called Lateral. He said, "I have conditions." Lateral said, "I expected you would." "The program doesn't just train operators," Marcus said. "It trains trainers. I'm not interested in being the single point of failure. I was the single point of failure for 6 people in Hadia, and 2 of them are dead. I build redundancy or I don't build anything." Lateral said, "Agreed. And I want a case review component, post-incident analysis, not to assign blame, to extract what works. Every casualty interaction that program participants are involved in gets reviewed and fed back into the curriculum." Lateral said, "That's going to face institutional resistance." Marcus said, "I know. I'm going to need your backing to push it through." Latrell said, "You have it." "Then yes," Marcus said, "I'm coming back." Before he drove back to the base to begin the paperwork, Marcus stopped at the commander's practice facility. It was evening, the field empty, the stadium lights throwing long shadows across the turf. Derek Harrington was in his office. He looked up when Marcus appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man constructing a prepared explanation for a conversation he had expected would eventually materialize. Marcus didn't give him the chance. He said, "I'm not here to make a point, Coach. I just wanted to say that the stress fractures in your left guard and your number 2 wide receiver are documented in the notes I submitted to Dr. Osei. If your new trainer doesn't catch them by mid-November, you're going to lose both of them for the season." He paused. "That's it. That's all I came to say." He turned to go. Harrington said, "Webb." Marcus stopped. A long silence. The kind that contains a man working against the particular resistance of his own pride, which in Harrington's case was considerable, and the outcome was uncertain for a moment before it resolved. Harrington said, "I heard what happened at the East Quadrant." Marcus said nothing. Harrington said, "I owe you an apology." Marcus said, "No, you don't. You made a personnel decision with the information you had. It was a reasonable decision." "I didn't ask you anything," Harrington said. "I looked at you and I decided who you were, without asking you a single question." A pause. "That's not a good way to make decisions. That's actually the thing I tell my players not to do." He stopped. "So yes, I do owe you an apology." Marcus looked at him for a moment. He said, "Accepted." He left. The Special Operations Medical Integration Program's new training cadre launched out of Fort Carson in the spring, 6 months after Marcus Webb signed the papers in a conference room where Commander Lateral shook his hand and said, "Welcome back, Iron 6. And Marcus said, "Marcus, call me Marcus." And Lateral said, "Give it a week," and was, in fact, correct. Within 14 months, the program had expanded to 7 commands. The case review component that Marcus had demanded survived 2 rounds of institutional resistance and was eventually adopted as a model for post-incident curriculum integration that a subsequent report credited with a measurable improvement in decision-making speed among operators in mass casualty situations. Terry Wills recovered fully. He wrote Marcus a letter that Marcus kept in the same drawer as the photograph of the 2 men from Hadia province, not as contrast, not as consolation, but as part of the same ongoing reckoning with what it meant to show up in the dark and do the best you could do. Marcus ran the program for 4 years before developing the train-the-trainer framework he had described to Lateral in that first phone call, a structure that distributed the methodology across 32 certified instructors in 9 locations, so that the knowledge lived in a system rather than a single person, so that if Marcus Webb was ever not available, the work would continue, and the work would matter. And the hands of 32 people would remember what they needed to remember in the moments when remembering was everything. He stopped saying he was uncertain whether he was still the person he used to be. He was. He was also something new, something that the person he used to be, stripped of the trauma and the guilt and the 3 years of hiding in plain sight, had always been capable of becoming. They called him Iron 6. They had always called him Iron 6, and now, finally, he had decided to answer. There is something important in Marcus Webb's story that goes beyond the extraordinary things his hands could do in the dark. For 3 years, one of the most capable trauma responders in the country was wrapping ankles in a football facility. because he had decided, privately and without appeal, that a tragedy he survived was proof of his own inadequacy. He had looked at two men he could not save and concluded that he should not be trusted with the lives of any others. And in doing so, he had withheld from the world a capability that the world needed. The people who build the best systems for saving lives are almost always the people who have stood in the rubble of the moments they could not fix. Not because suffering earns competence, it doesn't, not automatically, but because those who have genuinely reckoned with the weight of failure understand something about the stakes that pure technical training cannot fully teach. They know what it costs, and they build accordingly. Marcus didn't fail in Hadiyah province because he wasn't good enough. He failed because the situation was designed to fail, and he saved 4 people in spite of that, and then spent 3 years punishing himself for the 2 he couldn't reach. It took a gas explosion and 3 SEALs and a doctor who noticed how he folded field dressings to remind him that the measure of a person is not whether they can produce miracles in impossible conditions, it's whether they keep showing up to try. Whatever it is that you are carrying right now, whatever the version is of Hadiyah province that lives in your chest and tells you that you are not qualified, not ready, not safe to show up fully as the thing you actually are, I want you to hear this. The world does not need you to be without scars. It needs you to show up. Your past doesn't disqualify you. It is, in ways you may not yet be able to see, exactly what prepared you. Iron 6 answered when they called his name. So can you. Oh. If this story hit something real in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who might be hiding something the world desperately needs. Drop a comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have gone back? And if you want more stories about extraordinary people doing impossible things in the moments that matter most, subscribe right now. We put out new stories every week, and the next one might be the one that changes how you see everything.